Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dan Rundy, and I hold the Schreier Chair at CSIS. I also lead the Americas program. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation on Chile's constitutional revision. What's next? Before we begin, let's take care of some logistics. This event will last approximately 90 minutes. Following the speaker's remarks and a moderated discussion, we'll have a Q&A session from the public. We ask our audience to submit questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage. So again, I wish everybody good afternoon. I have to say, I have been scratching my head for at least 6 months now about how could a rise in the metro fee by 4 cents lead to a constitutional convention in Chile. That seems to me the key question here. Or at least that's one question, one approach you could take. Since its return to democracy in 1990, Chile has been one of the great success stories of Latin America and one of the great success stories in the world. Over the last 30 years, economic growth has averaged 4.2% per year, and poverty levels were slashed to single digits. In October 2019, however, Chile was taken by surprise by significant social unrest and mass protests. Last year, a national plebiscite determined the Chilean people's desire for a new constitution. There is concern, and I have a concern, that the constitutional reform process may change the economic fundamentals and political landscape that has allowed much of the economic growth Chile has achieved over the past 3 decades to be put at risk. Our event today will take a glimpse inside the constitutional reform process underway in Chile. I want to, and we should want to better understand what reforms are being considered and ultimately who they're going to impact. With our panelists, we're going to discuss best case and worst case scenarios. In addition, we want to, if possible, identify lessons from this constitutional reform process in Chile for the region and for the world. Not everybody we're going to have a broad set of spectrum of views, I think, on this panel, so we're going to have a chance to hear a number of perspectives. We're very fortunate to have 4 great presenters today. I'm really grateful to Ms. Isabel Aninat, who is the Dean of the School of Law at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. She's currently also director of the Sociedad Chilena de Políticas Públicas and a board member at Comunidad Mujer. In 2019, Ms. Aninat was a member of Chile's Technical Commission for Constitutional Reform. She has vast experiences on issues of human rights, labor law, minorities, and indigenous peoples. Thank you, Ms. Aninat, for joining us today. Our second speaker is Dr. Patricio Navia. He's a professor of liberal studies and adjunct assistant professor in the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU at New York University. Dr. Navia has written several books on Chile's democratization and political system and has deep knowledge both of Chile's history and of contemporary Chilean politics. It's great to also have you with us today. Also joining us is Dr. Javier Cuso Salas, a professor of public law at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago. His academic expertise is in comparative constitutional processes, rule of law, and constitutional jurisdiction. Dr. Cuso has written extensively on topics of constitutionalism and jurisprudence through his professorships at Universidad Diego Portales in Chile and at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Thank you, Dr. Cuso, for being with us. Our final speaker today is Ambassador Paul Simons. He's currently a senior fellow at the Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and served as the U.S. Ambassador to Chile from 2007 to 2010. Ambassador Simons enjoyed a distinguished career in both bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. From 2015 to 2020, he served as Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer at the International Energy Agency. Over the 4 years prior to that, he led hemispheric drug control and law enforcement initiatives for the Organization of American States. During his 30-year diplomatic career, Ambassador Simons served as U.S. Ambassador to Chile, leading one of the most active bilateral relationships in the hemisphere. So this is a great group for us to have a conversation about this really pressing and relevant issue. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Ms. Aninat. And Ms. Aninat, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here today with you. I just want to briefly sort of map out where we are right now, right? As you mentioned, the constitutional process has different stages. It had very important electoral moments, with the referendum of October last year and then the elections in mid-May. And it has a final electoral moment with the referendum around September of next year. So now we're in the main part of the process, which is the discussion. And let's remember that it's a maximum of 12 months, right? So it's 9 months, and then it can be extended only one time for 3 more months. And we are just about a little bit further of the initial month. So what we can say so far is that this initial month has been centered on the rules of procedure. And normally when a new Congress, for example, assumes, we don't see this part, right? The discussion of the rules of procedure are already set. In this case, obviously the discussion is open, but what we have seen is that so far the discussion has been working with the distribution in commissions, which is very common when you see the compared constitutional processes around the world, right? So we have different commissions, 3, I would say, which are very relevant, which is the budget, the ethics, and obviously the rules of procedure, and then some other additional commissions as well, which are also relevant to the main issues that are being discussed. And I'm going to touch on 1 second on one of those. What we expect is for this initial period to last around 10 to 12 weeks. Today, the vice president of the convention, Mr. Baza, said that he expected for this initial period to end around the end of September, first days of October. And then we will start on the debate of the constitutional issues or clauses per se. So what are the sort of main issues that I would say have been relevant? One is in the first few days, we saw a tension between what are the limits of the debates in terms of how much should the Constitution go into the contingency, right? So we saw, and we can talk later about this, and we have seen sort of a retreat from that, and the discussion much more centered on the constitutional issues and rules per se. And then we have seen in the different commissions or groups, 3, I would say, very relevant topics which have been present in the different discussions, and which we have not seen with this force in the legislative arena. so in Congress. One is gender. Of course, this comes from the gender parity rule, but I would say that gender in its different dimensions. The other one is indigenous peoples, with the discussion on plurinationality, and that also present in different forms in the rules of procedure as well. And the other one is the force of local territories. Not only subnational governments, so not only municipalities or regional governments, but also local forces per se. And that has to do with the types of rules of the election, of course, but also with, for example, the commission being present in different regions and cities. In this week, actually, they are sort of having public hearings in different regions and cities around the country. So I would think, just briefly, that those three issues, and we can talk later upon other, we will see them present in the discussion of constitutional clauses per se, which is something that we have not seen with this type of force and with this type of, I would say, focus on the debate of laws or reforms over the last few years in the legislative arena. And one final comment for these initial remarks is that it will be very interesting to see what happens with the electoral process that's going on in Chile right now, right? So we will have elections in November, and we will see the effect of those political configurations in the political configuration within the convention. And that is also very open still.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, let me turn to Dr. Navia, please.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation. I will keep my remarks short as well, just to complement what Isabel has said. I want to underline three things. First, why Chileans want a new constitution. I think it's important to understand what the expectations are. And the main reason why people want a new constitution is because they want expanded social rights. Isabel pointed to the issue of inclusion, right, indigenous rights, women, but most Chileans are saying that they want better pensions, that they want housing rights, more provisions, social provisions of different kinds in the constitution. So they really care about the chapter on rights. They care about the Bill of Rights. And this is why they support a new constitution. They don't have a firm opinion on whether they want a parliamentary system or a presidential system. In fact, most people, when they discuss the new constitution, they take for granted that we're going to keep the same political system. So they are not really discussing what constitutions really are about. In fact, Chile is, as far as I know, the only country that is concurrently having a constitutional writing process and an election process, meaning that we're electing new leaders under the old constitution that presumably will come in, and then 6 months later, the new constitution will come into effect. So in a sense, this is like when you get married, but you have to wait for about 6 months before you can move in with your new spouse because the old one has not yet left. And that doesn't really make any sense, right? Because precisely because we're having the constitution writing process that will outlast the election process, if the Constitutional Convention doesn't like the results of the election, they can strip the powers away from the president, or they can move from a bicameral Congress to a unicameral Congress. So the timing of the election and the constitution writing process just do not coincide, and that will probably have negative effects. Now, the most important consequence of the constitution writing process, precisely because people want to have new rights in the constitution, is that we're likely going to have a very long constitution with lots of provisions and social rights. You have to keep in mind that all constitutions written in Latin America over the past 30 years have been longer than the constitutions they have replaced. So we should expect a longer constitution with detailed provisions for rights that will be, however, unfunded rights. So the Constitutional Convention will write the checks, and then somebody else will have to come and find the money to pay for those rights that are going to be granted to people. So the long-term consequence of this new constitution is, first, fiscal imbalance, fiscal indiscipline, and then later disappointment, because people expect that this new constitution will give them rights that the country will not be able to pay for, because the uncertainty associated with the new constitution will prevent rapid economic growth in the years to come. And here is the final point. The experience we have had with previous constitutions in Latin America is that because they are longer, they are full of contradictions. Any long contract, it's an opportunity to have several contradictions. So the longer the contract, the more contradictions and inconsistencies you will have. And then that will generate uncertainty for businesses, for investments, after the new constitution is promulgated. So I anticipate that the new constitution will end up undermining the economic successes that Daniel mentioned in his opening remarks. But I will stop here and I will yield my time to the next speaker.
So, Dr. Navia, when I got married, my mother-in-law told me, ni cambio ni devolución. No sé, she's from Argentina. And she told me, ni cambio ni devolución. Chile's had 19 amendments to its existing. I don't get it as to why this is happening now, given that there have been tweaks by center-left governments in the past. Why are we having sort of why is Chilean society getting a divorce with this constitution?
Well, just quickly, the origin of the constitution is.
Sorry, and did your mother-in-law say the same thing to you? Ni cambio ni devolución?
No, I didn't get that warning.
Didn't get the memo.
But the Constitution's origin is illegitimate, right? So to some extent, you can think of Chile as Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and Pinochet is our Darth Vader. So we have an illegitimate origin. Our institutional system has an illegitimate origin. Certainly, Chile is not the only country to have an illegitimate constitution. I mean, you can think of Japan, that had a constitution imposed upon them. But there has been a process through which two different demands merged into one. One demand is for social rights, and that's sort of the popular demand. And then there is a different demand by many people that want to do away with the legacies of the Pinochet dictatorship. Since Chile was not able to try Pinochet before he died, we still have some pending issues there. Human rights violations, the legacy of those human rights violations, and many people think that by killing Pinochet's constitution, we can do away with those legacies. The bad news is that you are still going to be Darth Vader's son. The good news is that you can turn that force into something positive. I mean, what Chile should be proud of is the fact that we were able to build a well-functioning and pretty successful democracy out of a dictatorship and out of a constitution that was designed to prevent such democracy.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Cuso, I don't know how you follow that and comparing it to Luke Skywalker. I'm like speechless. It's fantastic. Go ahead, Dr. Cuso.
Thank you for the invitation, first of all. I am not a fan. I'm one of the few people in the world that never saw Star Wars, so I'm sorry about that. No, I just want to compliment. Chile had a very good economy for the last 30 years but the economic fundamentals already changed after 2019. In some ways, Chile is already experiencing very bad economic policies. And I think that one of the reasons for the demand of a new constitution was not only that it comes from illegitimate origin, but that it proved itself to be rigid, so rigid that when Bachelet tried to improve consumer protections or improve labor rights or decriminalize abortion in cases of rape. A very activist constitutional court, conservative one, uphold the constitution in order to prevent these changes. Chile has a rather strong, radical version of market economy. There are varieties of capitalism, but Chile has one that's really idiosyncratic. I don't have time to explain why, but what I can say is that people want social rights, as Patricia was mentioning, but also the political system entered into a huge crisis. The notion that economic elites had captured the political party system, the notion that Congress was not delivering change, somehow got blamed the Constitution because, just to give you a very clear example, the ideology of the Constitution, Jaime Guzman, was very candid when he said the very point of the Constitution is that democracy will return. And if our adversaries were to win, the Constitution needs to make sure they do more or less what we want it to do. So the notion that the Constitution is biased towards a model that was imposed by the military regime, in a way, ended the legitimacy of that. So you ask about best case, worst case scenarios. It's too early to know, of course, about that, but we do have some signs. The election of May of the constituent members was very much surprising. It was very much to the left and very much the election of independents. The right wing wanted to...
In quotes.
I know, there is a quotes, but they're anti-politics, even though they're organizing new political movements. And I think that the loss of the right wing of the veto power that they expected to have, the whole rules were devised to give a veto power to the right wing, that disappeared. The center-left collapsed in that election, had an electoral collapse. So what we have is a radical left, a left that is institutional, but still left, a right wing that's divided as of the last couple of weeks, one that's really has already basically defected. They're waiting this to happen, but they're already working for the reject. And the question is whether that bet is a risky one. So best case scenario, I think it's a constitution that's very Latin American, but more legitimate. We had a legitimacy problem with, you don't get 80% of the people saying, we need to get rid of the constitution. If it's just a matter of wanting more stuff. The worst case scenario is that this fragmented convention doesn't agree on a text, or that gets rejected. And I put that on the bad case scenario, because after the 2020 October referendum, legally, the current constitution would continue in place if it's not replaced by a new one. But sociologically speaking, we still are going to have a constitutional problem in Chile. And the fact that, I remember, Bachelet tried to pass a constitution, a new one, and he was told, there's no crisis. You don't do a new constitution if you're not in a crisis. Now, some people are saying you cannot deliberate under such polarized, critical moment. So my sense is that even though if these things gets rejected or if this process doesn't go to a good place, I fear that in 10 years' time, a truly populist leader does the kind of abusive constitutionalism that David Landau has described. That is, a popular leader gets not just a fragmented constitutional convention, but one that he owns, and writes a constitution that's designed to give her or him power for years to come, which is not, a constitution in the regular sense of the term.
Okay, I want to come back to this. This is very helpful. Thank you, Ambassador Simons. Okay, you've watched, my view, Chile's had a great deal. So, okay, the Constitution was quote unquote born in sin, or whatever you want to call it. I take the point, but this is a country that's had enormous economic success, has cut poverty, has created a middle class, is an exporter of capital, is a más o menos pretty functioning democracy, is as a member of the OECD, the cool kids club of countries, like the club of real countries. Chile's a real country. Are they going to blow it up? Are they going to throw it all away by going cuckoo in this process? That is what I'm worried about, is that all this stuff about making these adjustments, they may kill the goose that lays the golden egg of prosperity and stability in Chile. That is my worry about this process. Do you share that concern?
Well, I do to some extent, but first of all, let me just thank you for this opportunity to participate today in this session with these great speakers. Un gran saludo a todos mis amigos en Chile. I think it's important to note up front a little bit of what Pato Navia suggested. The boldness of the original Pinochet experiment. It's really unprecedented anywhere in the world, to remove the public sector completely from pension issues, from educational issues, from most of the time from health issues, and to essentially shrink the public sector as Pinochet did, and to rely on the private sector to deliver a lot of social services, in addition to the complete privatization of all of the basic utilities, water, electricity, telecoms, et cetera. So there really was, if you start out, say, in 1973 through 1980, through the end of the military years, and really the first 20 years of the Concertación, the center-left government, they were really operating under the basic rules. And it was a very, very dramatic shift. Nowhere else in the world really had people relied so much on the private sector to deliver services that in almost anywhere, even in middle-income countries, would be delivered by the public sector. Now, within this framework, as you point out, the environment for private sector investment was extremely positive. The tax burden was quite low. Chile has a public sector, it's only about 20% of GDP. Most other countries of its income level, it's about 30%. So you have a very lean and mean public sector that, in my view, from an institutional perspective, the context that we had and that I've had subsequently, the institutions are of high quality. However, within the last couple of years, it seems to me, there's been a broad public questioning, a lack of confidence in those institutions, which those of us outside of Chile think are admirable. I mean, we find the Chilean institutions to be first-rate, people that we can work with directly and operate on the same level, as you say, with the OECD. So the Chilean institutions, they have a different perspective outside the country than inside the country. Inside the country, there's lack of faith. Isabel has done a lot of studies on this, which I think are impressive. I think when you were with the CEP. The Chilean public has lost confidence in its institutions, but outside of Chile, we rely on these Chilean institutions in many cases to serve as examples for other countries. One example is the Agricultural Inspection Service that's led to this boom in Chilean exports of fruits and vegetables. I mean, this is a model for the rest of the world. President Lagos's work when he was minister on creating concessions for ports, airports, roads. I mean, these are quality, first-rate initiatives. So I think this is the challenge here, is to address the Chilean public's concern about lack of confidence in institutions, as you say, without necessarily destroying some of the facts that have enabled the private sector to grow. But look elsewhere around the world. The same companies that are investing in Chile, which has a totally privatized pension system, privatized until recently educational system, these companies operate in many other countries where they have to make contributions to pensions. where they participate in health payments and other things like this. So I don't think necessarily a constitutional change that bolsters a public sector role in some of these social services will necessarily damage the business environment. It really depends on how it's carried out. And Chile is a very careful country, and I actually have confidence that even if, let's say, 10 years down the line, Chile looks a little bit more like, say, Uruguay in terms of its, provides a bit more of a public sector support for some of these social services. I don't think that necessarily will destroy business confidence. It depends on how it's carried out. So those are a few perspectives that I have. And again, thank you for inviting me to this session.
Okay, so Ms. Aninat, so you described a process. Could you just comment on some of the comments that Dr. Navia, Dr. Cuso, Ambassador Simons, I'm concerned that Chile is going to overshoot in this constitutional process, that they're going to nationalize mining, they're going to nationalize pensions, that they're going to make it less attractive as a place for investment. And as opposed to Ambassador Simons ending up like Uruguay, it ends up like Argentina. So what is your reaction to that, Ms. Aninat?
Well, first of all, I have some comments about the process. Let's remember that the process was designed to start in 2020. So this overlap with the general elections that we're having this year was not originally planned. The whole process had to be moved because of COVID-19 last year. And so, of course, now we're in this very curious process of having the constitutional change with the elections of the next Congress and president. I would say that, as the ambassador pointed, we have had a general lack of trust in institutions in general, and that is very much focused, obviously, on Congress and political parties. Political parties in different services, if you look, they are within the margin of error, so 3%. And if you see the whole, if you back to the early 90s, this has been sort of a very, very crucial point of how democracy has been working along with Congress. But there's a lack of trust also in police, in the media, and also in very relevant institutions for Chile, for example, the Catholic Church. Obviously, for very different reasons, but the context of the last decade, I would say, was that many traditional and very relevant institutions for the Chilean configuration that had been very relevant, especially with the transition back to democracy, right, in the early 90s, sort of lost trust because of corruption, because of abuse, and because, as Javier said, because of sort of a stalemate in many issues. One very that we're seeing now sort of is the reform to the pension fund, which you just mentioned, right? So the reform to the pension fund has been being discussed for, let's say, 2008, I would say around 15 years at least. The reform to the health system, that has been discussed for over a decade as well, with proposals, with bills of laws being presented to Congress. So I would say that let's remember when we started this process, we had the outburst in October of 2019, and sort of this was sort of the institutional process being designed. And as there's, I think it's still too early to sort of advance what will be the final clauses of the new constitution. The current sort of configuration has many proposals going around. They are now, of course, centered on the rules of procedure, but but it has, I think, two main issues. One is that institutional process has been respected. At first, there were some questions, for example, of, well, will the convention start on the day that it had to start? There are questions about that. And what we have seen is that people are working, they're working under the rules, the sanitary rules, which are a new complication. There's public audiences being held, etc. And also there were questions about the quorum. So the 2/3 quorum, which is a very high quorum, even by international standards. And what you see now in the debate is that at sort of the months previous to the convention, there was a lot of talk about we should change the 2/3. And that, I would say, and you can hear it in the debate, has now sort of that debate has reduced, and now there's much more focus on, okay, let's get the rules of procedure started. I'm not saying that these issues will completely disappear, but I would say that was very, very, very much present in many academic discussions, and what you heard in the candidates has sort of now changed to let's focus on the work, because we still have time, but the time is still not, I mean, it's still 12 months. So I think these signs are promising in terms of having a functional process. Javier mentioned what happened if the new constitution fails in a 10-year period, right? But the question is what happens, and the question a few weeks ago actually was, what happens if the convention fails? And I would say that that sort of has now been sort of mapped out to having a much more functioning debate. And as I mentioned, I think this debate will see much more signs of the sort of issues. You mentioned natural resources, but the issues will have much more clarity after the elections in November, probably. And I would say that also one of the issues, much more than copper, will be on water rights, but also on the environment in general, especially with climate change and all of the sustainability issues in general. So the issues are much more centered on natural resources than on copper as it was, right, 4 decades ago.
So could you tell me, what do you think is the best, each of you tell me what you think the best case scenario is and the worst case scenario of this process? Ms. Ananat, what is the best case scenario going forward out of this process? What's the worst case?
Well, I think the worst case will be that the convention, for some type of reason, doesn't work out. That the convention, let's remember, has to produce a proposal for a new constitution, which has to be ratified by the referendum next year, right? Which has a mandatory voting. In Chile, currently, we have voluntary voting. So I think that will be the worst scenario. I mean, for a convention which now holds a lot of legitimacy, a lot of trust, to fail to produce a proposal for a new constitution. In the long term, I think there will be many issues on the transition between constitutions. This is not new in Chile. If you see, for example, we had a new or a constitutional change in 1925. That constitution sort of took at least 6 or 7 years to sort of come into place until the year 32. And so we will have a transition. What is the best scenario? To have for me, I am very worried about having a functional political system. I know, as Patricio mentioned, the focus is on rights. Obviously, it's very boring, maybe, to understand how the institutions work. It's not very appealing. But I think for the long term, the main challenge that we have is having a functional political system that has to do with not only the relationship between Congress and President, if we remain under a presidential system, but especially with the design of the courts. So I would say how, for example, we will have functional rights, social rights, with having a judicial system that works appropriately. So I would hope, for me, the best scenario is a constitution that sort of puts an eye on a better institutional design.
Okay, Dr. Navia, what's the best scenario? What's the worst scenario? You're on mute.
Well, I think the worst scenario is to have a constitution like a long constitution with full of inconsistencies, like that of Colombia or that of Brazil, or even worse, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. If you look at the previous evidence of constitutional processes in Latin America, none of them has worked well. So Chile is sort of saying, you know, they just haven't tried it the way we have tried it before, and we will do it right. But the history of new constitutions in Latin America is not a great history. If you look at the so-called more successful cases, Colombia and Brazil created new constitutions that produced huge fiscal deficits. And so that's the best case scenario in Chile, just to have a constitution that will have huge fiscal deficits. The worst case scenario is that we have a constitution that doesn't have a well-functioning political system, precisely because the members of the Constitutional Convention campaigned on social rights. They didn't campaign on constitutional issues. In fact, most of the constitutional scholars who ran for the Constitutional Convention were not elected because people elected people who promised them better pensions. And so the worst case scenario is that we have a lousy political process and a constitution with huge fiscal liabilities that leads the country right back into where most Latin American countries are, with constitutions that promise lots of social rights, but without a well-functioning political system and a well-functioning economy that can generate the resources to actually enforce those rights.
Okay, Dr. Cuso, what's the worst case? I think you talked about the worst case scenario. What's the best case scenario, Dr. Cuso?
Let me sharpen the worst case scenario. I think that in Chile we have been so far not affected so much by populism, the kind of nationalistic authoritarian populism like Orban or López Obrador or Uribe even. If we do not manage to get a new constitution now, I really fear that it will come back. I think that the current constitution that will, as a matter of law, continue to be in force, it's dead, sociologically speaking. It doesn't have the support of the people. After the 80% of people saying we want a new one, it's very tough. So if this fails, I envision that some populist leader with authoritarian, leaning authoritarian would like to have a constitution that united powers around her or him, and because you might have fiscal deficit, but to have on top of that an authoritarian leader, that's something we have been spared so far in the last 30 years. You might not like Piñera if you are from the left, but he's not a populist nor an authoritarian. The same goes for Bachelet or Lagos or the rest. So that's for me the worst scenario, because we tend to forget that the social uprising was really tough. We were on the verge of a bloodbath that night of November 12th. The young generation in the streets did not have a conscience of what it means to have the military in the streets with a curfew. The military were very prudent, but we could have had a really troubling situation. And the pandemic sort of helped us forget about that simmering tension that's still there. And the best one for me, given that I have this, I guess, more worse scenario than the one that Patricio and Isabel have, the best scenario perhaps is not that ambitious. When as Paul mentioned Uruguay, well, Uruguay would be a really good outcome for Chile. Chile would never be as business friendly as before October 2019, but that's would have been the case with or without a new constitution. In a way, the new constitution's hope is to try to channel something that was, because when you said at the beginning that this was, and you're right, Chile was held as a model transition, but a model transition doesn't end up with this. You have to account for that social explosion we had in October 2019. In other words, it was not a stable equilibrium. Otherwise, we would have not had this disaster. I guess there are things that we have to remember also. Chile has institutional endowments that are still there. Just to give an example, for the first weeks, the Communist Party wants to have a totally different process. They don't believe in a bounded, regulated constituent process. They want, as Chavez mentioned it, an assembly that's soberanissima. That's the word that Chavez used. That would basically declare that the Supreme Court ends or intervene the Congress. That has not happened, and I think that all the signals is that even the leftists, particularly the Frente Amplio, which are the critical political actor within that Boric group, they have been, I think that they are tributary of a long-standing rule of law, institutional, if you want to call it, tradition. And I think that it's the best, this is one of the last chances Chile has to institutionally channel something that should not have happened had Chile been so good as the statistics were showing.
Okay, Ambassador Simons, what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? Let me just say, okay, from a U.S. perspective, we're not. There's not a lot of attention on this in Washington. There's not a lot of attention outside. Yeah, there was some coverage of the unrest a couple of years ago, but no one's sort of following, as far as I can tell, other than sort of the plebiscite. And it's gotten a lot of positive coverage because Pinochet bad and there's therefore this good kind of a thing. That's sort of how I've interpreted the English language press coverage on this. But Ambassador Simons, we've in the U.S. operate as if Chile's a serious country. We never had, since 1990 we haven't had to the United States hasn't had to worry that Chile is gonna go sideways. I worry that some of the stuff where they, Chile could go sideways in this process. Ambassador Simons, what do you think?
Well, my view on this is that the U.S. government officials and other Latin American scholars and experts that follow Chile have, I think, more confidence in the Chilean system to resolve its issues in a responsible way than perhaps the people in Chile do. Chile is regarded as a country that can pull off things, and so I think there is confidence that the Chileans are going to work their way through this in a way that's not going to destroy the environment for the private sector. I want to say a couple words though about this kind of I think implication in this whole discussion that in order to get private sector growth in Chile, you have to maintain every single element of the Pinochet constitution and rights. I think that's completely incorrect. And my experience with the private sector in Chile, and I spent a lot of time working in the private sector, I never came across any private sector individual who basically said that their decision as to whether or not to invest in Chile had anything to do with a privatized pension system in Chile. Has nothing to do with that. What the private sector wants is consistency, regularity in treatment. Similarly, the health system or the education system. In fact, many private companies in Chile were concerned about the low quality of public education and ended up setting up schools on their own so that their workers were better qualified. So I don't think necessarily the private sector is leaning on every feature of that original constitutional arrangement as necessary to move ahead. Certainly, though you mentioned the environmental issue, and Isabel mentioned the environmental issue, Chile is going to be very dependent on having foreign investment in renewable energy to become the renewable energy and the hydrogen energy leader that it intends to be. So clearly you need to have the basic environment steady and favorable for this type of investment. But I don't think that the complete abandonment of the state role in these social issues, that has basically, it's been whittled down a bit, but it's still there. I don't think that, having a constitution that provides a bit more state involvement over time in things like pensions, health issues, educational issues, that's going to be problematic necessarily for the private sector. And I think that Chile will find a way through that, a gradual path, a path that respects rights that are in place. So I'm confident.
Ambassador Simon, since I have you, you worked at the OAS, you've worked in multilateral institutions. This is a domestic process that Chile is going through. Are there roles for the OAS or Friends of Chile at this time?
Well, I think one interesting issue that you raised before is Chile's involvement with the OECD. And of course, the IEA where I worked was part of the OECD. And I think one of the challenges is that outside observers are taking a look at Chile and where it sits vis-a-vis the other OECD countries. And Chile usually ranks at the bottom in terms of the social indicators, any types of indicators. But Chile is also kind of at the bottom of the per capita income in the OECD. So it's going to take a while for, Chile is not going to become Denmark overnight. And I think this is important for some of the critics, particularly in the academic circles, to recognize. Now, should Chile be compared with the Latin group, the Perus, the Uruguays of the world, the Brazils and Mexicos? Well, perhaps not. But I think the problem is that Chile is somewhere in between. It ought to be able to do better than its Latin counterparts, but it's not going to become, a Denmark overnight. So I think this is part of the challenge too, in kind of taking a look at what the next steps are.
Okay. All right. So I've got some questions from the audience. There's a thoughtful group here. Okay. So, question: could someone please address how Chile's military will be impacted by the nation's constitutional reforms? I have heard that there is a section on the military in the current constitution that could be rewritten. Could someone also address how this might impact the procurement of weapons and equipment? Tim, want to take this on? Please. You're on mute, Dr. Cuso.
Oh, thank you there. Thank you, Pato. Yeah. Not much. I think that the regulation is a residue of what the regime was when the Constitution was established. Most of what's there, aside from a line that's very traditional in Chile's constitutional history, the notion that the armed forces have to be obedient, disciplined, and do not politically deliberate, that would remain. I can envision that the armed forces as a chapter would be out of the new constitutions, and that wouldn't mean much. So I think that basically procurement and all those issues are dealt already with what's called the organic law of the armed forces. But those laws are going to be part of what Isabel was mentioning at the beginning, this after the constitution process of adjustment that happens in every country that introduces a new one.
Okay. The next question is, Ms. Aninat and Dr. Navia each mentioned the importance of social issues, including dimensions of gender and indigenous rights in this process. in what ways do you all anticipate these types of issues will be embodied in the new Constitution, where there'll be new institutions or articles dedicated to inclusion of these historically marginalized groups? Ms. Ananat, why don't I go to you first?
Thank you. First, I'm going to comment on something that the ambassador said, and just to complement. There's also a provision on the constitutional reform that established a process that established that the convention has to respect the republic, the democracy, and also the international treaties that have been signed by Chile. So in regards to foreign investment and the position of Chile in general in the system, in the global system, I think that provision is relevant. To the question, I think we can sort of anticipate. It's difficult to anticipate, but that gender and will have an importance not only in terms of rights. So there has been a lot of discussion, for example, in incorporating reproductive rights, but also in terms of, for example, the distribution of the labors of cuidado. Sorry, I forgot the word. Sort of looking out for older people and
elder care issues.
Thank you. I forgot the word. And sort of including gender provisions within the labor rights or other rights as well. So, but also, which is very interesting, is the inclusion of gender in terms of the institutions. So, for example, if you see now in the rules of procedure, the commissions are being chaired by with a gender distribution. So there's a man and a woman, and also so you can anticipate that gender will be also, for example, debated on the institutional design. So, for example, will we have gender quotas or parity rules in institutions that have boards or other types of corporate governance, right? I'm thinking, for example, this debate in the courts or in the Supreme Court. And in terms of indigenous rights, there's what has been talked about a lot has been the concept of plurinationality. It is a concept that is present in constitutions such as Bolivia and Ecuador. It is a concept that is broad, and if you sort of examine it, you can see that also there's advances of this without using the concept in countries such as New Zealand or Canada, so it has a lot of interpretations. But I would say that we will probably include the concept, at least as a principle. The debate has sort of been centered on its inclusion, and then we will probably have a debate on the inclusion of specific indigenous institutions. We have ratified in Chile the 169 ILO convention, but there's a debate, for example, on the inclusion of indigenous property, on indigenous self-determination in terms of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, which Chile also signed. So I see the different dimensions of plurinationality in terms of not only the concept, but also its different institutions will be very present in the discussions that will come up in the months ahead of us.
Dr. Navia?
Yeah, I agree with the things Isabel has said, but I want to underline 2 points. The first point is that, again, the main focus of the constitutional debate and the campaign for the Constitutional Convention election was on rights, including indigenous rights, women's rights. So we have been talking more about whether the central bank, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve Board, will have representation of indigenous people, but we haven't really been talking as to what mandate the central bank will have. So again, I think we are concerned about things that are relevant but not the most important issues in Constitution. And the Constitution is about the institutions, and we're not discussing the institutions yet. Gender parity might be an important component, but if we throw in gender parity in every institution, I guess Ruth Bader Ginsburg's hope that eventually the Supreme Court would have 9 women members in Chile will never be realized, because we're going to have gender parity in every institution. And then that leads me to the point that I really want to stress, and that is we are discussing policy issues as constitutional issues. And I think that's a mistake, because the political process should determine a number of policy issues. Elections matter, and they should matter. So if we want to engrave everything in the Constitution, then we're going to have problems in the future, because elections are going to, or those election winners are going to be significantly constrained. Elections should have consequences. We cannot put all the policy issues into the Constitution, because policy issues do generate differences and different views, and they should be decided upon in an electoral process, not put into the Constitution. And final quick point, since Isabel mentioned the ILO 169 convention, one of the issues that still is pending, and we don't know how that will be resolved, is whether the Constitution itself should be put under 169 consultations with indigenous people before it can be ratified. You can make the argument that the Constitution itself has to be ratified under the 169 convention. Perhaps Javier can explain that a bit more, but that, I think, has not been yet decided as to whether that will apply to the entire Constitution of Chile after it gets drafted.
Okay, you all mentioned the general lack of public trust in institutions. How much of that distrust is based on frustration with the lack of minority representation, and how much of it is based on other factors? And if so, what are those factors? Let me turn to you, Ambassador Simons, first.
Well, Dan, I don't have too much to comment on this from inside of Chile. I would just note that from the outside looking in, it's very interesting. Isabel's studies that she conducted when she was at the CEP suggest that there has been a rather dramatic decline in the Chilean faith in all of its institutions. Almost every single public institution has suffered decline, but over the last, say, 10 years. When I was in Chile, the movement was actually in the opposite direction. People were developing somewhat greater confidence in certain institutions, certainly the military and the police, and even issues related to human rights in the military and police were kind of improving. Now that's gone down. Faith in almost every single Chilean institution is down. However, from an outside perspective, looking at it, say, from Organization of the American States, International Energy Agency, U.S. government, looking broadly around where institutions are elsewhere in the world, I have not detected anyone from the outside believing that the performance of the Chilean institutions has necessarily weakened. So it is a bit of a dilemma for an outside observer to understand this. I think, Dan, you and I share that, where there's a confusion. I can't answer the question. The only point I would make is my sense from living in Chile for 3 years, Chileans are very hard on themselves. They're very, very hard. And they have very demanding and high standards, in particular in issues like corruption. So a level of corruption, a corruption incident in Chile that would go uncommented on in another country could become a huge public explosion. When I was in Chile, for example, there was a scandal because one of the police advisors to the president delivered some goods in a public sector vehicle that were sold outside of La Moneda. This was a front page story in the newspaper. You know, the level, I think Chileans are very tough on themselves. They're very self-critical, extremely self-critical, and focus a lot on polling results and comparisons to other countries. And when you're comparing yourself to the OECD, you're going to be in the second half. It's a simple fact of life. Chile is not Denmark. So I'm not saying that there aren't fundamental problems in institutions. I'm sure there are, but I have not detected, and the people that I work with that work with Chileans on a day-to-day basis have not detected that these institutions have suffered in quality. So clearly there's a public confidence issue here, but whether it's really related to fundamental declines in these institutions or other things, it's difficult for me to say.
Anyone else want to take on this question of lack of public trust? Why is there lack of public trust? And Dr. Cuso, let me go to you.
Yes, I agree with most of what Paul says. Actually, I think that it was a gradual thing that started. It was a combination of more transparency, which is welcome, but also with an accumulation of corruption scandals that happen in institutions that we're not used to have. The police in Chile is a national police. And aside from the dictatorship time, people trusted carabineros. They still trust, even after a lot of things that happened. But corruption at the level of the high rankings of the military, of the carabineros, white-collar crime that went unpunished, even when you have collusion of pharmacies that deal with, medicines, that started to accumulate. Capture of some legislatures through bad campaign finance. I think that this made up for, and the political parties, people talk about the political class as if that's a bad word. It's like the nobility before the French Revolution, the political class. So nobody wants to be part of that political class. But so if you say things like, I don't know of any democracy that works, that doesn't have political parties. People look at you and say, I hate politicians. That's it. So I would love to invite Paul Simons back to Chile to tell us that we're being perhaps too tough on ourselves. But aside from the joke, really, it was too much of a sense that the law was not evenly designed and applied. This, white-collar crime in the U.S., notions that a millionaire can be condemned to 150 years in jail, that's a joke in Chile. You would never go to jail in Chile for a white-collar crime, and people resent that. The democratization of the culture in Chile. Chile used to be a very elitist culture. And I think that over the last 30 years, that's the part of the modernization theory that's very predominant among sociologists in Chile. I buy. There is a sense in which people are really a more horizontal. They do not accept that somebody that's in a privileged position gets a lesser punishment for something that she or he did that's wrong. And the Catholic Church, Isabel also mentioned something. Even if you were not Catholic, the pedophile scandal of the Catholic Church was exactly the coverage, not as much the crimes, but the cover up. I'm sorry, that's the word that happened at the highest levels of the church. And you have to understand, in Chile, the business community, the Chilean business community, it was very tightly, joined with the Catholic elite and with the right-wing political parties. That was bad for Chile. It's been very hard for the right wing to have a more diverse, as in Holland. I meet people in the Netherlands who are right-wing people who fund right-wing parties who are not part of a former, noble elite. There is nobility in the Netherlands. So in Chile, it's very much, and that's ending as a result of modernization of society. But we're in this crisis in which we're very tough on ourselves, as Paul says.
Okay. Yes, please, Dr. Navia.
Yeah, I think I want to underline one point particularly for the U.S. audience, because Chile does have high levels of inequality, and so does the U.S. So many people might want to say, so what? But I think in addition to inequality in Chile, we have lack of social mobility, right? So in my classes at NYU, I normally ask students to look around and mentally point to the person they think comes from the wealthiest family. And students laugh. It's impossible to identify who comes from the wealthiest family. But in the case of Chile, inequality is associated with lack of mobility. So the place where people are born determines very much the place where they will have in society throughout their lives. So people feel that we promise a level playing field, but that level playing field is never really materialized. And there is a sense of discontent against the elites, because those who oppose social mobility are obviously those who are on top. Because if you are on top and there is social mobility, then there is the risk that you will no longer be on top when there is more competition. And I think that's the point that Javier is making. So I just want to underline that point and distinguish the key difference with other societies that also have high levels of inequality, and that is the absence of social mobility in Chile. Social mobility is very, very limited, and people resent that.
Ms. Aninat?
Well, just to add a different dimension to what has been said, when you see the different polls, you also see a criticism on how the public institutions work. So you see, for example, a lot of comments and criticism on how the provision of different public services work in practice. It's very clear in the health system. So what in Chile is called listas de espera, waiting list to have a easy surgery, sort of tonsils removal or something like that, and also the use of the entire hospital. So how they are being administered, and you see a lot of in health it's very common, but you also see it in other dimensions, such as, for example, the level of paperwork that is required to apply to a certain subsidy. All of this has rapidly changed over the last years. The last year with COVID has brought a lot of devastating effects, but it has also brought some good things, and one has that state has gone digital in a lot of paperwork, and you see this with what in Chile is called IFE, which is the money transfers now currently because of unemployment. But I would say that a very sort of or an important challenge that we have for the days ahead beyond the Constitution, it's sort of the modernization of many crucial state institutions, even if they are administered by private organizations. For example, we saw this very clearly in the discussion about Sename. Sename is the sort of, what is it called in the US? The social services for minors. And it has some public hospices and homes, and also some privately administered. And what we saw there was a huge crisis. This is very common in other countries as well. But I would say that the challenge that we have ahead, especially if the Constitution gives away more or regulation for state institutions, is having institutions that work with people in a very, very different way, especially with a more educated population, but also with a more elderly population. Chile has a high rate of elderly people, and the projections for the decades ahead is that the growth of population over 80 years will be very important. So that will be especially straining the health system. And I think these type of challenges have a lot with how the entire political system is also perceived.
Okay, so Dr. Cuso, mentioned the possibility of a populist leader coming along in the near future and taking advantage of this constitutional inflection point to abuse term limits and give themselves undue power. This is how the person who interpreted what you said, Dr. Cuso. What do the other panelists think about this possibility? Do the other panelists see the potential for a populist movement, or do the other panelists think Chileans are sufficiently self-aware to prevent this type of thing? So let me start with you, Ms. Ananat.
Well, I think first of all, if there's a lot, or not here, but in the previous months, there was a lot of questions about if this will be a Chavista process, right? And I would say the reality in here is very different. In this constitutional process, there's no single leader that is moving sort of the different forces and sort of trying to establish himself or herself its own project. So if you compare it with what happened in Venezuela in the late 90s or in Ecuador, it's very different. I would say the reality today is of fragmentation. So we have a completely fragmented political system. We saw that in the results of the convention. We also see it in other types of elections as well, and we also see a population that is not voting in big numbers. Right? We have a problem with political participation in elections, and we will see what happens in November. But I would say that, of course, as Javier mentioned, the populist movement is around in different hemispheres, in both hemispheres, but also in different types of political regimes. So I would not sort of see this as something that cannot happen in Chile, but I would say that it's different from what happened in the most talked about constitutional processes in Latin America of the last decades, at least.
Okay. Dr. Navia?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Dr. Cuso, go ahead.
No, just to get to be precise, my fear is that if this process were to collapse, the constituent process, the constitutional issue will still be lingering over politics. And then is when I see a very worst case scenario, some years, from now, where somebody uses, calls for a new constituent process that would have all these anti-institutional features that Isabel was mentioning in the case of the Chavez case. It's not that I'm thinking that this one, I would say the opposite. There has been, aside from the Communist Party that was never part of the first agreement, has always wanted to not respect the rules of the game of the constituent process, and the Lista del Pueblo that seemed to be very strong a month ago now seems to be going down. I think that the process is largely going to be abounded, a process that respects the constituted powers, the current existing powers.
Great. Dr. Navia?
So we have a problem with countries with high levels of inequality, because democracy and high levels of inequality do not go together. So you should think of high levels of inequality as like a recovering alcoholic. So the country can go dry for many decades, but you're still a recovering alcoholic. And then when you start drinking again, recovering, coming out of that crisis might be somewhat difficult. And I think that the big risk in the constitution writing process is that we will end up with a populist constitution, a constitution that guarantees way too many rights and that does not have the funding for those rights. Because if you guarantee many rights to an unequal society, what you will end up having is disappointment when those rights cannot be enforced. And my big concern with the constitution writing process is that we will write a constitution that is like a wish list with all the rights that we would love to have, but we're not going to have the type of economic growth that will allow the government to fund those rights. And I think that's when the disappointment will begin. People are going to be happy that the Constitution says you are going to have a great pension, and then they are going to be disappointed when they realize that the only way you can have a great pension is if the country develops. And as the country fails to develop, then disappointment will follow.
Okay. Ambassador Simons, do you care to comment on this? You're on mute. You're still on mute.
Sorry. I agree with Pato Navia on this. I think there is some risk that perhaps too many rights might get written into this Constitution, and that over time that could lead to some fiscal pressures. What I don't know, and not really close enough to know, is whether this can be managed on a kind of a gradual basis. So, whether rights have to be delivered immediately, or whether over time, which has kind of been the process over the past 30 years. I think it's important to note, again, and I don't mean to repeat this too many times, but the Pinochet started out with, a complete withdrawal of the public sector from, practically every social part of the economy. And that's been whittled down over time. If that whittling process continues, perhaps with a little push from the Constitution, I see that as kind of a good thing. But if it gets accelerated too fast and creates a lot of tension, with other actors in the society, with the private sector, then I think it could be problematic.
Okay, so we're coming to the almost to the end of our time together. I really appreciate you all taking so much time to be with us today at CSIS and with our audience. So I want to ask you each to kind of leave us with a parting thought about the constitutional process. I wrote an op-ed saying I'm worried that this could go overboard. So let me maybe go back to each of you and say, are you guys guardedly optimistic, concerned? How should our viewers think about the current state of the constitutional process, and are your expectations that this is going to llegar un buen puerto, as they say in Spanish? This is going to have a happy outcome. So let me start with you, Dr. Navia. How does the Star Wars movie end, Dr. Navia? Do we blow up the Death Star? Do we not blow up the Death Star? Do we go into a 12-step program, not into a 12-step program? What happens?
Well, I think the big risk for Chile is that Chile will be just a typical Latin American country. And that means countries with high levels of inequality, without the promotion and respect, or sufficient promotion and respect for private property and property rights, and thus without the needed economic development. And there is no reason to think that Chileans are genetically superior or somewhat different than the rest of Latin America, except that they have a constitution that protected institutions and private property. And that's certainly at risk. So Chile is not going to become Venezuela or Haiti right away, but the big risk for Chile ahead is that we become Colombia, with a new constitution that grants rights to everyone, and those rights then lead the Constitutional Tribunal to enforce or force the government to enforce those rights, and then Colombia has to have a tax reform every 2 or 3 years, and it can never develop where it needs to develop in order to provide for all those social rights granted in the Constitution. So I don't see the outcome as being Venezuela or even Argentina. I see the outcome more as being Colombia or Brazil, with a really big burden in terms of fiscal spending that ends up undermining economic development. Or to cite Octavio Paz, the great Mexican intellectual, the state might become this philanthropic ogre that wants to do good things, but is just too big to effectively deliver, and then it undermines economic development and the private sector.
Okay, very good. Dr. Cuso?
Yes, I just want to I am reasonably optimistic. In Chile, it's very cool to be apocalyptic about this. But my sense is that we were in real trouble 2 years ago, in deep trouble. Some people, the president was on the verge of resigning. Some analysts predicted that. And not just a resignation for Chile, that would have been a first since the recovery of democracy. My sense is that there are two things that a constitution can provide. Distribution is one of economics or economic power or economic resources, as Patricio mentioned, through social rights, but also recognition in the sense that Nancy Fraser means, like recognition of the dignity of some groups that were excluded symbolically, and not that symbolically. Chile is still a racist country in a very subtle way, and not so subtle, but not in the way in the US you have racism, particularly against the indigenous peoples, but also class-based. And I think that the Constitution, and gender is another issue. Chile was way, lagging in gender rights. And I think that in that side, that's something that it would be a plus. The legitimacy of having a constitution that was not imposed by a, criminal regime. I mean, I'm not being overstating the nature of for the House of Lords of England, at least, I'm not overstating the nature of that regime. I think that the legitimacy of the constitution is not irrelevant. And if it does something to renew trust in the institutions, the political institutions, which were bankrupt, I think that would be a plus as well. My sense is that the Chileans are not as naive as to think that, at least not all of them, that if because you have a social right in the constitution, that means that you are going to, go tomorrow to get it, and therefore be very disappointed and be liable to follow the next populist that comes. My fear of populism was if this constituent process fails, not if it succeeds. So I'm, reasonably optimistic in light of the mess in which we were. Because if we do not take stock that what happened in October was something that exploded on our face, we didn't expect, we didn't see it, of course, this is all not a problem. It's only a problem. This process started as a way to channel institution in something really bad. And on those terms, I think that there are reasons to be relatively optimistic.
Okay. Ambassador Simons.
Thank you, Dan. Well, first of all, thank you for running a really fascinating session. I've learned a lot from listening to all of the excellent experts. I remain, generally speaking, an optimist on Chile. I guess I've been optimistic always about Chile. And I do think there is scope for some expansion of the public sector role in the social sector in Chile. I think the public sector is still very, very, very small by international standards, and that there can be a greater role. I agree with Patricio, though, that the way in which that is kind of communicated and ensconced in the Constitution will be important. You want to avoid a situation in which those responsibilities are imposed immediately or at a catastrophic cost. But I don't think Chile is like Brazil. I don't think it's like Colombia. I think it's quite different. And I have confidence, perhaps misplaced, but I have confidence in the Chilean constitutional negotiators that they will see the broader national interests and they will be able to sort this thing out. So that's my optimistic view.
Dean Ananat, why don't you close it out for us, please?
Thank you. Just two issues that I would like to point out. One is that for the coming months, maybe the debate will sound very confusing, and please keep in mind that we will have elections at the end of this year. So part of the discussion has to do with the general political forces being negotiating, and we have the registration of candidates, not only for president, but also for Congress next week. So you will see, in general, a lot of political movement in Chile in the coming months, and that, of course, can sort of make it even harder to read what is going on. The second issue that I wanted to point out is that there's many new issues that will emerge that you won't see in other previous constitutional process being very common. So I mentioned gender. Of course, indigenous rights is something that has been present in other countries as well, but you will see, for example, climate change being addressed as a constitutional issue, which will be sort of something very new. And there are some other issues that you will see having much more force than in the Chilean debate we have been used to over the last years. Of course, this will be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity sort of to address issues that will have a special interest in Chile in the coming decades. Of course, everything that has to do with the environment, but also the role of local governments or regional governments, which has been something that we have sort of lagged upon on the last decades. So I would have an invitation to keep an eye on those issues which can maybe be also addressed in other debates in Latin America later on, as sort of we tend to see that issues now have a transfer from one country to the other. Finally, I'm cautiously optimistic on the process, which we have seen in this month and few days, is that even though there's many challenges, this is 155 people who had not met before, who had no rules of procedure set upon, have been working. We have seen discussions, of course, but we also have seen, at least for now, respect for the whole procedure that had been set in place, and sort of a commitment for the process in general to work. So we still have very intense few months ahead of us, and the discussion of substantive issues, which are very important. But I would say that let's hope for the best.
Thank you, everybody. We should end it here. I'm grateful all for your time. We'll end it here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much to you all.
Bye-bye.